Welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I am Tim Durling and I thank you for tuning in to this episode. On this episode I'm going to be going through a cassette collection again because I grew up buying cassettes, and as a matter of fact, the fact that this band on cassette, it means a lot to me. I'll get into that, but first I want to remind everybody of the contest that I've got going on. 200th episode of Tim's Vinyl Confessions is coming up very, very soon, and very, very soon. Getting lots of entries, and thank you to everybody that entered. I have a classic rock CD prize pack to give away, 7 CDs, all artists that have been featured on one of my episodes at some point in the past. And so to enter the contest, you need to follow me on Facebook if you don't already, and send me a message on Tim's Vinyl Confessions Facebook page and answer this question. This is the skill testing question, and it's not very hard. What band was the subject of my very first episode? So Tim's Vinyl Confessions episode 1. Who was the band? And even more than that, the fact that I called this show Vinyl Confessions is because this band has an album that came out in 1982 called Vinyl Confessions. So that should be a clue as to one of the groups that are featured in this prize pack. Also, as a bonus, if you want to make a guess as to who the 7 CDs are by, write down your guesses too. I've pretty much already given you one of them. But if you're close, I'll throw in some extras. I'll get some spare cassettes. I'm not sure, but I've got some spare stuff here to throw in to this prize pack. And I'll choose a random winner from everybody that enters. So looking forward to that. So now, we'll get down to the business at hand of today's episode, which is a reboot episode of my Bon Jovi cassette collection. Now, Bon Jovi are the band that got me interested in not only hard rock music, but also wanting to do more than record songs off the radio onto blank cassette tapes. Wanted to invest in whole albums and listen to entire albums, read the liner notes, digest the liner notes. Very crucially important band. Even though I haven't been much of a fan of anything that they've done in the last few years, I identify so strongly with their earliest albums, or some of my all-time favorite albums and songs, and I first heard those songs on cassette. So this is a look through my Bon Jovi cassette collection. The first Bon Jovi album came out in 1984. Here it is on cassette. This is obviously a Canadian cassette. You can tell by the QC10. We'll get more into that as I open it up. That's what it looked like on the side. This is a Canadian Columbia House edition, a later one because it's a clear colored cassette, although the J card doesn't look all that different. So my original cassette didn't look like this, but the J card was very, very close. And that's what the cassette looks like. I've always liked the logo they used on the inside of that. That was actually designed by, let's see, who designed that? Anthony Bon Jovi, so John's younger brother. And of course, this had Runaway on it, which was the first top 40 single. The QC10 refers to polygram cassettes that came out in Canada at the time that had this QC10 quality control. Quality has a name. Brent Underhill, if you're watching this, Brent would sign his name to that. Quality has a name. I'm endlessly amused by that. So that's the first Bon Jovi album. The first one I actually bought, and I didn't buy it when it came out, of course. Like many, it was the success of Slippery When Wet and the singles that did it for me for that. But the second Bon Jovi album was actually the first one that I ever bought, sometime in early '87. 7,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This is again a Canadian issue on Mercury Polygram. The American cassettes look way different. This is the actual cassette that I started off with. And what's odd about this one is it actually has the songwriting credits written. It's very small. It's got all the songwriting credits. And this is not my original 7,800 Fahrenheit cassette. I haven't played it in a long time. I don't know if it works anymore, but just seeing this brings back a lot of memories. And of course, there's no lyrics or pictures in this. There's a lot of both in the record. But it did have some credits. I would just devour these credits, finding out where it was recorded and who produced it and who mastered it. This is where all of that music minutia started, was with these Bon Jovi albums. Of course, the big one, the pivotal album, was 1986, Slippery When Wet. And for some reason, I know it had 2 different covers, but for some reason the cassette cover looked like this. Didn't have the title written on it. Just had this plain cover, which is very striking and stood out. And man, I know a lot of people that own this. This is an American copy. It looks way different than the Canadian one. The Canadian one was red on the side with black lettering. This is on, of course, once again, Mercury. This part looked different as well. And there's the cassette itself. This was a huge album, obviously. You know, it kind of goes without saying. Classic shot of them from the You Give Love a Bad Name video shoot, the video that would make them superstars. Now, what I do like about this American cassette is, unlike the Canadian one, it has all the lyrics to the songs, but these credits are the same. And I read these credits inside out. So names like, you know, Bruce Fairbairn, Bob Rock, Desmond Child, George Marino, Mark Weiss, all of these, Doc McGee, all of those names, they meant something to me. And I was like, okay, they're associated with Bon Jovi. But the other thing I liked about the Canadian version of this, which this one does not have, is that it also had a flap in it that's also available, and it listed the first 2 albums. So I think that's a lot of the first time a lot of people realized that, hey, this is not the first album. They've got other albums to explore. So I got huge into Bon Jovi. I started buying Metal Edge and Hit Parader and Circus, and just wanting to find out more about bands like them, see if there were other bands like them. So I got into Cinderella and Whitesnake and Europe, and it was such an exciting time. But it seemed to take forever for the band to put out a follow-up album, and it's, to this day, the most excited I've ever been to buy a new album was in September of 1988, when finally, I mean, 2 years is not a long time to me now, but 2 years was a heck of a long time back then. You were waiting for new music from a band you liked, especially a band that you were so into, when this finally came out, New Jersey. Still my favorite Bon Jovi album, by the way, to this day. And I can still remember walking down to my local Sam the Record Man from school. I was in grade 9, and was disappointed to get down there. They didn't have any cassettes. They had a couple of CDs, and nobody I knew had a CD player at the time, and they were like $30 or more. And they had one record, and I did eventually get it on vinyl, but at the time I would have had to dig out my parents' old record player, and I almost did. That's how bad I wanted to hear the new album. I heard Bad Medicine because it was the first single. That's how bad I wanted to hear the album. I would have bought it on record before anything else, which I would go on to do things like that. But the next day I found it at a little store in Holton, Maine. It was more of a bottle exchange, like a beer store, and they sold new cassettes. And there was the front sign as you walked was one of those arrow signs that said Bon Jovi is in. So I went in and scored this cassette, this New Jersey cassette. So here it is again on Mercury Records. Just love this album, inside and out, every note. Got it pretty much. It's one of those albums. Actually, each of these 4 Bon Jovi albums I could just play right here. So that's the cassette itself. And John with his coat with basically the same thing on it, although that is Hugh Syme artwork. You can tell by looking at it if you compare that to the Whitesnake album that came out around that time, that sort of stone wash finish. And another band photo and all the credits and lyrics, and I devoured this album. Still love it to this day. It was 4 more years before there was another Bon Jovi band album, and it came out in 1992, and to me, this is merely my opinion, the last really good Bon Jovi album from start to finish. Some people didn't like it. Some people just kind of got off the train with New Jersey. But I really liked Keep the Faith. This is a Canadian copy of Keep the Faith on cassette. Came out in fall of '92. And they were the only band of their era that survived the grunge era. And they went to some drastic measures to survive it. But not so much with this album, I don't think. It was different, but still very much a rock album. This is actually a Canadian Columbia House cassette version of it. Lyrics, credits, some photos. Like I said, it was different. Still had some hit singles off of this one, and I actually saw them twice on this tour. The first 2 concerts I ever saw. Met John Bon Jovi in Portland, Maine. Got his autograph. Of course, it was long before the days of cell phones, but I mean, it was a trip. It was a real exciting thing for me. I'd never been to a concert before, and no better band for me to see first in concert, and they were really, really, really good. So the next thing that came out from the band for an album came out in 1994. By then they'd amassed, suitable amount of hit songs, like legitimate hit songs, to basically it was worthy of putting out a greatest hits album. And so the Best of Bon Jovi Crossroad came out in 1994. A pretty comprehensive collection. By this time, Mercury CDs and cassettes looked like this on the side if they were not personalized or sort of customized. And pretty good summation of their stuff to this date. It's a Canadian Columbia House version. By this time, the CDs and cassettes pretty much all had the same stuff inside of them. And very minimal on the credits. You can kind of tell it's the 90s, though. The photographs are looking different. They're kind of washed out. They're definitely not as glamorous as the older photos. But like I said, they survived the era. The next studio album to come out was for me the first time that, like, this was still one of my favorite bands up until this point. And it was the first time that I'm like, wow, I don't really think I like this all that much. These Days, 1995. Had high hopes for this album. Peter Collins produced it. It's a good sounding album, certainly. But it's really, really mellow. Like a lot of the songs, there's some rockers on here, like Hey God and Something for the Pain Isn't Bad. But it's just a mellow album. And could never really embrace this album. I've gone back to it and would find myself just kind of drifting. But here it is on cassette. This is a Canadian Columbia House one. Some of these latter day ones, Columbia House was having a blowout sale on cassettes. So obviously by this time I was buying the albums on CD first. Extensive credits inside of here and all the lyrics. I just wish I could say that this was an album I particularly got into. But this is just my opinion. This could be somebody's favorite Bon Jovi album, and if it is, that's cool. Then it was a long hiatus for them, and this brings up to the last cassette that I have to talk about. Finally, in 2000, I heard a new Bon Jovi track, and I got really, really excited. It was It's My Life, which to me, aside from the modern sort of production, was classic Bon Jovi in form, writing. It was an anthem. It references Living on a Prayer. It had the talk box in it, and it actually became a hit single. So it kind of reintroduced them to a new generation, but sounded very much like their old sound. And so I went into the new album hopeful. Unfortunately, it really wasn't any better than These Days overall, but I mean, it had one, I think, outstanding song on it. And here's the album. It's Crush. This is an unopened copy that I found because I bought it on CD years ago. And I found this copy marked down. This is a Canadian version. By this time, they'd kind of morphed onto Island Records, which is still under the umbrella of Universal, so it's really the same label. I don't have a lot of cassette tapes from the 2000s that aren't reissues, so this is kind of a cool thing to pick up. Now, after that, there were more Bon Jovi albums that came out on cassette. A lot of them only came out in foreign territories, and I never really spent a lot of time looking for them because my fandom kind of wavered, but I'll always identify as a Bon Jovi fan, and I always loved that early stuff. So that's a look at my Bon Jovi cassette collection. Remember, enter the contest. You could have a shot at winning a classic rock CD pack, and if you need to go over the requirements again, which I'm not requiring much out of people, just go back to the beginning of this episode. And thank you so much for watching Tim's Vinyl Confessions.